Hello and welcome to the International Schools podcast. My name is Dan Taylor.
My name is John Micton. Join us twice a month at the International Schools podcast as we have conversations with international school leaders, educators, and entrepreneurs working and engaging in the world of international schools and education.
And finally, just to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, ASA for Education, for making this podcast happen. Now on to the episode. Hi, welcome to the International Schools podcast. I'm here as always with John Micton. How are you doing, John?
Great, Dan. It's really nice to have you back in Europe, and we have kind of a busy schedule together with guests and some, specials that we're going to be doing. So yeah, lovely to see you and lovely to be here today.
Yeah, I'm back from Asia, from 3 months in Asia, back in Prague now. So it's been great, exhausting trip, but it was good. We're going to record an episode about it, I believe, next weekend, aren't we?
Yes, absolutely. So today, right now we're in the middle of December before the winter season holidays, and it's recruiting season. And of course, recruiting is such a big thing. And for people, it's very stressful. It's very exciting. For schools, it can be exciting, but it can be stressful. And there's so much tied to it. It's so complex, especially in the international school space. And Dan and I thought, wow, we should really spend some time. And really what we're going to be doing through the conversation is really hopefully giving some strategies, some ideas, giving some context about recruiting. And this is really for people that are starting to think about recruiting for 2023. So maybe in the spring, they're thinking about it. Summer, they start putting their resume together. And then in August, they're starting to contact the different recruitment agencies. And I just really excited to have our guest, Pete Kennedy. Pete and I had the pleasure of working together in Japan. I'm not going to say how many decades ago, but and we've kept in touch. Kept in touch for a long time, and he has been ahead in many different international schools and even done some startups. So, Pete, welcome to the International School Podcast. And if you can just give us a quick little bio, 30 seconds, so then we can kick off.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, John. And Dan, nice to meet you. John, it's great to connect again. We go back into the 90s, my friend. So I think that ages us a bit, but we're still young at heart, right?
Yes.
I've been overseas. I've just returned to the States for a year working with Search Associates. But I was overseas 35 years. I've worked in 9 different international schools, ranging from Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Sudan, Italy, Brazil, Vietnam, etc. I probably missed one or two in there. But I started out as a high school math teacher and coached a lot of sports in the schools I was in. And then I moved into leadership and was a high school principal, middle school, high school principal at a few schools. And then finally, I was a superintendent of a network of schools in Vietnam. So I've done the teacher, the principal, the head of school roles, and now I'm working consulting with Search Associates. And it's really quite fun to help schools and candidates connect. And it's kind of keeping your finger in the international world, but it's almost like teaching again. We're teaching a lot of the candidates what to do, how to do it. And when they land a job, I'm as excited as they are. So I get all excited about this. So it is quite fun. It's quite stressful for the candidates and teachers in schools sometimes. But in the end, when it all works out, it's quite fun and it's quite enjoyable to do this. So happy to talk about any questions you guys might have or how we can give some tips to new teachers thinking about starting their international career. I, like many, went overseas. I found out about international schools like serendipitously. I was doing a Fullbright Scholarship in the Philippines and met some guys playing basketball on a Thursday night in the International School of Manila. And I just said, what's this about? And they told me about international schools. And I went overseas for 2 years at the American School in Japan. And then 35 years later, I'm back in the States. So I started out with a short-term plan, and then it turned into a lifelong career, which I would never, ever trade. And you meet great people like John along the way. So,
Pete, where are you based now? Where in the States are you now?
I am kind of trying to figure out where I'd like to live in the States. So okay. I'm in Savannah, Georgia right now, a lovely southern town, antebellum town. And I'll be continuing my international gig. I guess after the holidays, I'll be going to Australia for a few months, and then maybe Japan for a quick pit stop. And I live on a sailboat in the summertime in Sag Harbor, New York. And then after that, I don't know what's going to happen, but I bring Search along with me as we go.
So your Search is completely remote company. As long as you can cover the time zones, you can live anywhere.
Yeah, and I was at the NIS People of Color conference last week. So you recruit in. I work in the southern regions in the United States. So my territories are Georgia, Florida, around the Horn out to Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and then my candidates who are all overseas. So I'll recruit stateside teachers to join Search. There are other associates that work with the Midwest or the Northeast. And then there are associates based in England or Australia. So we're all this kind of loose network of remote people, but my focus is generally the southeastern over to the southwest United States.
Great.
So if you were to join Search, you would, if you said you were from Florida, you would be designated to come to my office. If you were from New York, you'd go to Arnell's office, another associate's office.
Got it.
Cool. So Pete, one of the things I think is important for us to understand is there are kind of macro trends and micro trends with recruiting, schools, jobs, professional development. And there is a whole cohort of people that are on the circuit. So they've gone to one or two schools like ourselves, and we get to know people. And sometimes we don't recruit agencies, and sometimes we do. And there's also a whole cohort of educators in North America and Australia, all over the world, in Africa and Asia and South America, that want to begin that journey. So there's kind of these two cohorts. But I think what would be really interesting to understand is kind of the macro. What is happening? There are international schools. There are a lot of them. What does the market look like? If you can kind of give us a macro, and then we'll look at the micros.
Yeah, I think overall, macro is the trend that we see, the most prevalent trend is the sheer number of international schools and how the face of international schools are changing, and how I think a lot of domestic teachers, whether you're a teacher from Australia, the UK, or the United States, I don't think domestic teachers realize how big this is. There are, last check, I wrote down some numbers from ISC research, and there are almost 6 million students registered in international schools. So that's been in the last 10 years, that's an increase of almost, it's doubled just about. There are 570,000 teachers working at international schools. The income from tuition is now at, I believe it's $53.8 billion. If you were to take that in terms of a GDP, that's above the GDP of Costa Rica. So this is really, really big. And I think a lot of domestic teachers say, oh, there's a few schools out there. No, there are 13,000 of these schools out there, and they're growing, and it's growing and growing.
It's interesting that I'm skeptical about the ISC numbers, honestly, because I've tried to pull together various lists of international schools. I can't, no matter, even if I count like Bob's English kindergarten, I still can't get it over 10,000. I mean, I think it's, personally, I'd say it's like 10,000, actually, maybe in semi-international schools. I think that 13,000 number, it depends what you count. There's a lot of local government systems have English language programs, and I think they include a lot of those in that number as well.
I think, Dan, if we're going for macro trends, the trend is growth. Whether we want to say it's 13,000, there's a lot. I think it's a lot. I think that's the issue, and I think the growth of international schools bodes well for teachers, because
definitely,
as the looming teacher shortage is happening around the world, it's going to impact international schools. So it used to be, years ago, there were probably more candidates than schools, or equally numbered. It was challenging. Now there's going to be a lot fewer candidates for a lot more schools. So it does bode well for the future.
Interesting.
Although the face of international schools, I think, is changing. Historically, I think John, referred to in a past podcast about the NGO, the non-for-profit board of director run schools that was run by an embassy, that wasn't for profit, that was in a major city. And they were mainly expatriate students with a sprinkling of host national citizens in the school. And I've worked at many of those as well. But what's happening is, and again, Dan, if you want to go with the ISC, roughly 70–80% of students now are host-national citizens attending
Yeah,
international
definitely.
schools.
And
So what's
90%
happened is,
are for profit. I mean, give or take,
yes,
give
and
or take
that's where
10% as well.
the rub hits.
Yeah.
So it's a different face of schools now, because
Yeah.
there are still those traditional schools out there that are run by nonprofits. They're board of director run. They're not looking to make a profit. Any money they have extra goes back into the school. But there are now corporate entities out there. There are founders of schools, and there's a whole labyrinth of schools and types of schools and reputations of schools that a candidate has to kind of negotiate. And that's
Yeah.
where working with an agency can help them, right?
Definitely. Yeah, for
Yes.
me, I'm fascinated by this topic. John, we've had a couple of episodes. I think Denry, we did 2 episodes with Denry, I believe, talking
Yeah,
about this
yeah.
kind of thing. And it's a complex situation now, because it's not just profit for profit. You've got a lot of different price ranges, mid-tier schools, they're sometimes called lower tier. You've got a lot of franchise schools for typically the English private schools have kind of franchised their names to local private equity property companies, all kinds of things who are running schools. You've got various other networks. So yeah, it's a very fragmented system, but increasingly a lot of school groups. I think you would agree, like more and more groups of schools. You obviously had the big ones traditionally, like Cognita and Nord Anglia and GEMS, but now you've got a lot of regional ones. You'll have a bunch of schools in Asia, you'll have a bunch of schools in the Middle East, and that seems to be increasing as well.
Yeah, and there are different types of schools. Like there's a charter group from the United States that's really big now in China. There are schools that are running satellite campuses where you as a student can go to school perhaps in one country, but the school has networks to all these different countries. So you could actually country hop as you go through school. I mean, that's a really interesting model. So you could be a student and take a year in Italy and then go to France and then go to Tokyo, and you could go around. So there are really unique models happening out there now.
Definitely.
So,
fascinating.
Pete, we have this really big organization of international schools, different colors, different shades, different ways they engage, different ways they deliver learning. But if I am a candidate and I want to begin this journey, what are some things that so let's talk about a candidate that has never done this. So they're in the local public school system. They might be in an independent school in their country, and they want to go out. What is kind of the timeline that you would tell them to start thinking about in some of the key?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Even for seasoned international teachers, I think people get it a little bit wrong. The research that my company Search has done is, if you look at recruiting as a bell curve, right? So if you look at the season starts to heat up kind of in October, it starts. But the peak hiring season is that December through February, where a lot of the teachers think, if I don't get a job by October for the following school year, I've missed the boat. It's really December through February is the big hit. So what we tell candidates to do is be ready, get yourself organized in the summer before you want to go. So August 2022 for August 2023 school year.
Yeah. So we're in 2023, we're in the spring now, or late winter, spring. So we're saying this summer you need to start getting involved.
Yeah, if you're looking to do 23-24 next school year, you've got to get on it right now. Like right now is the time to start. You've missed a little bit, but it's still not too late, because that December, February is the big push. There are still jobs that go all the way through. I placed a candidate in July, August for August. Like there's still jobs out there toward the end of the year. But if you want to get in the mix, you can't wait any longer. Now is it for a 23-24 school year. So we tell candidates, be ready over the summer, get your resumes together, get your little video together, be online, get onto the websites, start looking around, so you understand the process. And then when October hits, you're ready to go. Like you're on it. Even September, really, you should be going. You should be active in September, August, September. to get
I'm
those
interested.
early announcements, right?
I'm interested in what you said earlier about the sort of, obviously in the US and the UK, there's becoming a real teacher shortage now, and you think that
Mhm.
trend's going to come into international schools. Do you think
Sure.
that's already starting? And also, do you think it's also? I'm curious. Obviously, John and me are from an IT background. I'm curious about a lot of our listeners are tech directors and tech people. Do you think there'll be a lot of opportunities for maybe people with a tech background who haven't worked with schools to move into working with schools and things? Or do you think that's there's not going to be a shortage of those kind of roles? Do you think it's more going to be the teaching roles?
And again, this is only my humble opinion. I think there's yes and yes. It's going to be shortage and shortage. Yes,
Yeah.
I think schools are realizing the importance, especially. I mean, there's pre-pandemic and then there's now, and there's a totally different. It's totally different. So schools are realizing that the importance of being nimble in their tech. Not only because once you say I'm going to go all in for one, we're going to go all in for Zoom. It's going to change in a year or two. So what's the new thing? So getting tech professionals out there, if they have an education background, so much the better. But I see schools looking for people that can manage their hardware, maybe not so much their educational technology. But John would know more than me. John's a tech director.
Yeah.
But I think there's a combination where there's educational technology. Yeah, that's a given. Like we need teachers to be upskilled. We need students to be upskilled. We need their platforms. We need to be able to go remote on an instant. We need to be able to be nimble. But I think there's there may be a need for those hardware folks to get in there. Maybe they don't have educational backgrounds. So,
Yeah.
John, I don't know. You would
Have
know
you
more than
seen
me
a lot
about
more
that.
jobs, sort of tech director type jobs, John? I mean, the ones I've noticed have been a similar amount, but do you think it's starting to increase more kind of open positions and things?
I think it also depends on countries because I think in some countries you have a wealthy group, wealthy skill set of local tech guys. So if you're
Yeah.
talking like, I'm just wondering in my current situation, they're all local guys. They've gone through the local polytechnics, the local technicums, and they're running our systems. They're not going recruiting abroad.
Yeah.
So I think and I think if you're thinking of pedagogic, so an IT director that can manage the education technology, the pedagogy, the library, kind of the curriculum, then usually what you're going to do is look for somebody that has that experience. And that might be more in North America, Australia, or the UK,
Yeah.
or those kind of areas.
And following up, John, I think what I see is there'll be a director of technology, educational technology, who will be a pedagogical leader in terms of that. They will then hire an assortment of people to work in their team. Some of them will be tech facilitators that work directly with teachers in educational technology, and other folks are just database managers or hardware guys. Like they don't need to be educationalists, so to say, but that head person tends to be someone who's going to have the understanding of the school and how the systems work. Like John was talking about libraries now, with even college counseling with Navion software. There's a lot going on.
I was just
they
curious
need some technicians.
Yeah, I was just curious, John, if you've started to see for the tech director positions, more positions becoming free. Do you think that trend has kind of started yet? Like, or is it still? You think it's still kind of a similar supply and demand still?
I think part of the thing is tech directors tend to stay much longer in those positions because if you're going to implement, say, a switch to the Google Workspace or Microsoft or whatever, that takes time and student information systems. I think it's just, you can't really be a tech director, go for 2 years one place and then go 2 years. There's no, these things take time and it's a change process.
Yeah.
So I think, many of the people that you and I know and colleagues have been in their positions for quite a long time. So I think
that's a good point, John. And getting back to maybe Dan's question in a little bit, maybe getting back to that teacher who's looking to go out overseas and the shortage of teachers that's looming. Right now, I don't think in the group that I'm working, I can only maybe say from my experience with Search Associates, and maybe I'll expand out about that a bit. But in our group, we only work with about 800 or so schools. We keep it kind of lean and mean. These are good quality schools that we've vetted to make sure that candidates are going to have a good experience. So we vet schools and we vet candidates to make sure we have good candidates, good schools, and then we put them together in a bit of an ecosystem to try to make some matches that they see fit. But what we see is there's in our school group, there's still plenty of applications going to those schools. But I think there are going to be, I'm seeing a little bit now, some of the schools who are new, maybe startup schools, maybe not in a consortium, for them to get high quality teachers is becoming a bit of a struggle.
Yeah,
I think.
good
And I
point.
can see that emerging, where if you're in Search Associates and we have a pool of good candidates, we have 3,000 jobs posted. I think we're still okay there. But the new candidates are quite different than maybe John and myself as candidates. When we talk about hiring, maybe let's get back to some hiring a bit.
Yeah.
The way candidates used to hire was through in-person job fairs. There was no other, before the internet, or even with the beginning of the internet, you could not really contact a school. So you had to go to an in-person job fair. If I'm working in Kuala Lumpur or Tokyo, I'd have to fly into London or somewhere to go to a job fair to get a job. And that was, you just factored that in as the cost of doing business. Is that, John, is that what we've done in the past, right?
Yeah.
So what's happened now is, we're in the pen. So I'd say 80% of the jobs were filled at in-person fairs. Then the pandemic comes and everyone moves to platforms like Zoom or similar. And schools had to be nimble and start recruiting virtual fairs or through just their own systems, Zooming conferences. So now we're coming through that and we're going, my age group is going, hey, we can go back to these face-to-face fairs now. So now the face-to-face fairs, the schools still want to do it. For example, our Cambridge Fair was the flagship fair. We have now, I think there's 80, 85, 90 schools signed up. And we don't have many candidates signed up. So the candidates are digging this whole idea of, hey, I'll just Zoom with people. I don't have to fly somewhere, take time off work, have the cost and expense. Why can't we do it through Zoom? So we're at this push point now where if I'm a candidate and I can get to the searches a fair now in person, the ratio of schools to candidates favors the candidate very much right now. I'd get on a plane if I could and go, if that's possible. If it's not within your finances or your time, I understand that, and don't of course go into debt. But it's shifting now, so I don't know how the recruitment's going to be as we go forward out of this. Where the new teachers coming in, for the last 3 years, there really haven't been any face-to-face fairs. They haven't experienced that. They're saying, I'll just Zoom with people. Why do I need to get on a plane? So it's really interesting what's going to shake out as we move forward. I don't know if that's a segue that's you guys
so
yeah,
Pete, are you then saying that those recruitment agencies like yours, Search Associates, have to start thinking of hybrid? So you say, okay, we have 85 schools in Cambridge. We're going to use Cambridge, Massachusetts as the example. You have 85 schools. You have maybe 120 candidates come, but usually you're used to having 350, and you're saying, okay,
600.
Well,
when
600.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to say, oh, we'll go hybrid. So you can either physically be there or you can Zoom in, and we're going to create a platform.
Yeah. But the thing is, I think people don't realize the face-to-face. I mean, Zoom is, I think, 80% good. I mean, it's like online teaching. It's good, better than not having anything, but it's not as good as being in that classroom with those kids face-to-face. And I think that's where those in-person fairs is. You get to meet people and talk to them. And the other thing that happens is, I don't think candidates are aware that when I would go to a fair as a recruiter, you would be recruiting all day and talking to candidates. And then afterwards, you're going to meet up with some of your friends who are administrators, and you're going to, maybe go have a little dinner or maybe a cocktail, heaven forbid. And you're going to be talking, and you'll say, hey, does anyone know anyone? Like, I interviewed a really good candidate. It's not a great fit for us, but man, what a great grade 3 teacher. If anyone's interested, check this person out. So there's a lot of networking that goes on. Or someone may say, hey, I'm really looking for that physics teacher. And someone will say, yeah, I interviewed a really good person. Boom. Then a lot of that happens. So I think those in-person fairs, there's a lot of the front office of it, but a lot of the back end of it happens as well. So I think if I were a candidate and the ratio is pretty good, I would seriously consider trying to attend one. I think that would be a really good move, especially if it's your first time doing it. You get to meet people, talk to people. It gets you it gets your resume seen. When you send your resume in digitally, how do you separate yourself? But when you're there in person, your personality comes out, all those things come out. I think that's an important aspect as well.
I think that's
So
I think that's
Pete,
great advice. Sorry, John.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
No, after you.
Pete, so what about the veteran teacher that's been to 3 or 4 international schools and they're saying, I don't need to go to a fair. I'm going to use my professional learning network. I worked with this principal. I'll write to the schools. And they start really leveraging the professional learning network and they feel, okay, the fair and a recruiter is not as important. Now, that might be different if you're transitioning to a leadership position.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, how do you answer that where somebody says, well, I don't really need to go to a fair because I have this professional learning network. I worked in 3 other schools. I know enough people and I'm going to reach out.
Yeah, I think, yes, that's a strategy that some people use. And I've used it myself at times. Excuse me. But I think we have to also be careful of, it's changed now. So how do you get your resume to the top of the pile? If you know someone at that school and you have a network, well, great. But how many schools do you have that much connection to? I sit there, I go through resumes with people all the time. Like, you'd be amazed how these veteran educators have really kind of poor resumes. So I spend a good deal of my time resume coaching, just getting getting things in tune. So I think there's strategy that people have to make and feel comfortable. I was more of a plan A, plan B guy. So my plan A was, hey, I would go and do some on my own, but I would also have a plan B where I would use an agency because there'd be things I wouldn't be aware of. And that's the things where I always felt I was open to different experiences, and from when I was a teacher. So I never thought I would end up in some of the places I did. But because I was made aware of these different positions, I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. I never would have thought of going to Kuala Lumpur. And there I was in this fabulous school. So I think, yes, I agree, John, that people can do this on their own. And people have great success. But you're narrowing your window a little bit if you do. I'm more of a big plan person because you don't know what will pop up for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
For a new teacher out there, I do think, as we mentioned before, the landscape has changed. So I really think if you're a new teacher, you have to be careful because there are many, many really reputable corporate schools or founder-led schools or for-profit schools. There are many very reputable, and there's no problem with that. So I'm not saying for-profit is better than non-for-profit or vice versa. But what I do know is there are some schools out there that are for-profit at the expense, perhaps, of students and teachers. And as a new teacher, you have to be really careful not to get yourself in a situation that is not a good fit. I'll put it that way. So working with a reputable agency, I think, is really important for a new teacher, because you get to. I think the nice thing about search is a candidate has an associate, so that candidate has someone like myself. And I'm available to Zoom as much or as little as they like, contact as much as little as they like, to talk them through. Even when they get a job offer, we talk it through. Yesterday, I went through the contracts with a teaching couple and went through what's on the contract, how does it work, what's taxation, all those, so they feel comfortable with that. And then the schools within our network have been vetted to be reputable schools. If you're out on your own or you're working with a group that's kind of headhunting you and selling you to schools and arranging things for you, you have to be really careful. So do your homework is, I guess, what I'm saying. Like, make sure you're getting yourself in the right spot. Because like when John and I first went out, there were a very limited number of schools. And generally, they were not for-profit schools. And generally, you were treated really well. The landscape has changed a little bit, and if you're a school owner, and maybe you don't have the best interest of a teacher or a student at heart, and you get $100,000 surplus, does that go back into the school for computers and programs, or does it go into your personal funding?
What do you think about websites like, I don't know if you're familiar with internationalschoolsreview.com, and these ones where teachers can, it's hilarious. It's actually great comedy. John, I think I shared my login, but it's interesting. It's pretty comprehensive. It's basically where people anonymously review their schools and everything. They review
Yeah.
leadership.
I think the
And,
intent of that was really good. I think their intention was pure, but
yeah.
most people don't want to pay $25 to praise their school.
No, there's not a lot of good things being said. but
So,
you can compare. Does it have more bad things, or a lot of like a few bad things, a medium amount of bad things, or like a huge amount of bad things? You know, and so I think it's still a valid comparison. I mean, there's a lot of people on there, and honestly, I think I couldn't. I hope I don't know this person in real life, because I would just, based on how they're communicating, you know, they're just like in a terrible way, because it's anonymous, you know, and no one can. And there's
It's
a lot
anonymous.
of people like that on there.
Yeah. I think what we tell teachers is this, and in our group, and for me, in any situation, I would strongly encourage a teacher, if they're interviewing with a school and it's going well and they sense it's going well, and maybe at their second interview or third interview, and the school maybe has an offer, or who you feel is about to make an offer, or the school asks you, hey, do you have any questions or anything like that? You automatically say, may I speak with a teacher in my demographic at that school?
Yeah.
Schools are really happy to do that. In fact, in my previous schools, when I was recruiting as a recruiter for those schools, I would insist that a teacher speak to another teacher.
Yeah.
If I had a single female teacher, look, I'm a 60-year-old, guy. I don't know what it's like to be in Hanoi as a youngish single female. So I'd have them talk to a specific person on school, and the teachers would volunteer to do this, so that a young teacher or a teaching couple with children could say, hey, are there pediatricians? Are there play dates? Are these things happening? So that they can get an understanding of the school from a teacher's point of view. And then you get it from someone who is at that school in that situation, not being censored by the administration or anything, but saying, hey, talk to these people. So that's a very important thing. And I encourage all candidates, whether you're working with an agency or not, just say, hey, can I speak to a teacher at the school? If the school would say no, then I would really recommend you think twice about that experience or that offer.
Yeah, definitely.
Pete, one thing also that you do, and that a lot of educators around the world, they become teachers, they may become great team leaders, PYP coordinators, and they start having roles of responsibility, and leadership becomes one of the professional goals. And transitioning to a leadership position then can sometimes be quite challenging, because if you've been a teacher and you don't have that experience, it's really hard for your resume to stick out. And I think there is a lot of advantage to working with organizations like yourself to get some coaching and also get those, connections. What are some tips, or what are some things people should be thinking about if they're going through the leadership route? So I'm assistant principal, I want to become a principal. I'm a principal, I want to become a director. Or I'm a teacher and I want to become an assistant principal. Those transitions.
The biggest transition is from teacher to admin. That's the most challenging, because there are many teachers that want to move into admin. And before a candidate does that, I often talk to them about, think this through. It's a really, I enjoyed working as a teacher, and I enjoyed being an administrator. I thought it was a school leader. I thought both were great. I was a teacher for just about 18 years before I went into leadership. And I think you have to be really careful, because some teachers really love the classroom, and then they don't realize that leadership comes with some challenges in terms of, you have to essentially, sometimes you may have to fire a teacher. You may have to expel a student. You get into things that are really challenging, like on a professional and personal level, with teachers and students and families, and it can be really, really challenging. So I always talk to people saying, are you prepared for that? Are you prepared? Like we were talking just before, John, and you said you had some difficult situations in your current school that you had to deal with, and that was really, it hurt you as a human being, like, to be doing these things. So, when you do the right thing and people abuse you on the internet, like, you have to be ready for this. Like, so I think you have to have a thicker skin and look at the big picture. And I often caution people saying, are you ready for this? But getting back to John saying, how do you do this? You have to build up a skill set. So in a school, I think getting involved with, from teacher, become a head of department, work on the accreditation teams, Get yourself out there and do accreditation visits with schools. Get yourself in these positions where you're in this mid-level leadership. So the next phase is the logical next phase. So if you're just a classroom teacher, and I'm a classroom teacher, I'm really good, and I've done nothing in accreditation, I've done nothing to volunteer at the school in different ways, I don't have a master's degree, I don't have a certification, I don't have anything that's leading me toward that trail, it will be very challenging. But what you want to do is set your position up where the next logical step is. So if you're an HOD and you're working on the school's accreditation and you're on their leadership team and their advisement team, you're doing all these little steps that add up. Well, the next logical step is to an assistant principal step. And then when you get into that level, what are the things you need to start doing, thinking ahead? So the next logical step is to become a principal. So when you are an assistant principal, are you mentoring teachers? Are you observing teachers? Are you involved with the board of directors? Are you volunteering for these different aspects? So the next logical step is, hey, this person's done all these things. The next logical step for them to be would be a principal. Is that too broad, John, or is that?
No. That makes that. I think that's really helpful. I think, for people have to understand it's a professional path, and you have to be deliberate about it.
And you have to be walking up that path. And when you start, sometimes a teacher will say to me, "Oh, I've been a teacher for 20 years. I want to be a principal." Well, okay. Well, what have you done to get there? Have you gotten your master's degree in school leadership? Do you have a certification? Do you have any internships? Do you have any experience as an HOD? Do you have any, what are the steps that the next brick down the road, and then you're ready for it? Because you don't want to jump in when you're not prepared either, because then you're putting your career at risk and the school at risk. So have you done things that have displayed a leadership characteristic that you can verify? Like, I'm doing this. Oh, the next step is to do this. Boom. Right.
And I think what's really helpful is that it's how deliberate it is. You have to really say, professionally, I'm excited. I want to do this. I'm going to go and get the further degrees or the further professional development, and then really be proactive in saying, let me volunteer, and I think that's so important for people to understand, because I think, so often leadership positions, especially, if you're trying to become a principal or even a director, those are big positions, and of course the process will be far more intense, and they're going to look for very specific experience that fits.
If you don't have if you don't have your philosophy and your goals clearly defined in your head, when everyone's in the room and there's a problem going on, there's a big discussion, and everyone turns and looks at you like, okay, what's your decision? And everyone's looking at you, and you got to say, okay. You can distribute leadership, you can, collaborate, but at some times you'll have to make difficult decisions. And in your skill set, can you weigh the options, and can you make a difficult decision by collaborating, by getting opinions, by doing all these things? But is that in your skill set to stand there and make a decision, and then live with it? Evaluate it, reflect upon it. But that's something that I find sometimes educators want to please people a lot. And everyone wants to do that, I think. But you have to be really careful. You have to make decisions that maybe would not be pleasurable for some people. Yeah. And that takes a little bit of, that's not a learned skill. That's just, can you deal with that? I guess that's one thing I think of, right? There's the humanistic side of leadership, and there's the professional side.
Yeah, so when we talked to Arnie Beaver, he said very similar things, John, about, showing intent, doing, like you mentioned, are you taking on leadership positions within the school? Are you doing the, a master's degree or whatever else it is? It's interesting. And also, I think, you mentioned this, but I really think it's true that a lot of people don't think enough if they want to do a leadership position. Do you think it's the next step? I should do it. And it's it's like, if you put yourself in a few leadership positions, you might find actually that you don't want to do it. It's not absolutely not for everybody.
And Dan, I think there's a really good point there. When you are a teacher, and the next step, step, it's not a huge step, but the next step would be an HOD, a head of department, or a team leader, or something in that grade level leader responsibility. You get a taste of it. Yeah. And then right then and there you can say, I kind of find this intriguing. I like the whole macro approach. I like to be doing these different things. I would like to have more of that. Or you may feel, not so much. And then you should say, well, what else can I do as leadership positions in a school? I may really like curriculum. Well, you can get involved in leadership from a curriculum standpoint. I can get involved in leadership from a technology standpoint. I can get into counseling and do those things. So there are other avenues in leadership that don't necessarily have to be principal, assistant principal, head of school.
Yeah.
There's some really cool jobs out there that maybe take a different skill set that would be better for a candidate. So they could reevaluate what they're going to do. So each step you take, you can sit back and then reflect upon, okay, now I'm an assistant principal. I see what the principal's doing. Is that something I want to do? Yes or no? Hey, I see what the curriculum coordinator's doing. That looks interesting too.
Yep.
Then once you get to the next step, then you evaluate where you are and you evaluate the next steps to see which of those fits you personally and professionally. And I think the personally gets forgotten sometimes. I know a lot of heads of school that sometimes feel totally abused and their hearts are broken, but in public they can't do that. But their hearts are broken because of what's happening to them on the internet or whatever. And they're trying to do the best job they can. So that's a personal side of this stuff. So I think you have to be prepared for both personal and professional.
Yeah.
Maybe a different approach, but.
And we had Dr. Helen Kelly on, and actually she's coming back because she just did a huge study about leadership burnout. And she was saying about how, principals and directors and heads and assistant principals, it's full on. You're giving, it's all emotion. It's all transactional with adults and kids and parents, and it's nonstop. And everybody comes to you for constant solutions. And as you said, and I think you said it really well, you can have all the shared leadership and vulnerabilities and collaboration, but at
you can do what all the books say, but eventually they're going to look at you and say, what's your decision, right? And there you go.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
But I think it's even more important from an international point of view. I think sometimes leaders in the States don't realize the intensity of the international experience, because if you're a leadership position in the States, of course you care for your teachers and your students. I'm not saying one person cares for them more or less, but internationally, I was involved in someone goes to the hospital at night, I'm going to the hospital with them. We're in Hanoi, Vietnam. Someone falls off their motorbike and they don't have anyone else to call. Who do they call? They call you. So you're involved in, I've been involved in divorces. I've been involved in all sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily have to be involved in a domestic situation in the US, UK, or States as a school leader. You're involved in, kids getting sick. You're involved in all this stuff on a 24/7. So, when I was a principal in the States, I did a quick stint in the States. I wasn't the first port of call for something that happened in a teacher's personal life. But sometimes overseas, you're involved because there's no one else to contact. Family isn't there. Maybe the friend network isn't there. The teacher doesn't know how to speak the language and they're going to a hospital. I arranged to get the school nurses and we triage this stuff. So it's much more intense on the outside of school. I think the inside of school thing is relatively the same. The outside of school is quite different.
Do you think there's it varies between different types of schools? Because the reason I answer that is because, obviously you talked about the advantages of working for a sort of tier 1 traditional international school. The packages are usually good. It's a not-for-profit, so there's a focus on teaching and learning. But if I take all the people I know who work for all kinds of different international schools, typically take someone like John, the kind of schools he's worked at, those kind of jobs in leadership is usually, pretty much give your life to the school. Your social life is other people in the school. Your work is very intense. But I think there's definitely kind of some of these, I don't know what there's no official word, but say mid-tier other schools where I know people who kind of have quite an easy life. They maybe don't get paid as much. They don't get the good conditions, and maybe it is a for-profit school, but in some cases it's actually a much more manageable workload. Not always. You can have for-profit schools that people work even harder than other schools. But have you seen that kind of trend and any breakdown like that, either of you?
No, not really.
No.
I think, I'm sure there are schools out there that aren't requiring you to do a lot. I've I haven't really been associated with that. I find
Yeah.
sometimes the for-profit schools require much more of their teachers because they're really focused on cost. So they'll give a teacher 7 preps. They won't hire another teacher. They'll just give the section to another teacher. Like it becomes challenging. There are all levels of schools. There are all levels. There are lots of teachers that are involved in language institutes or tier 3 schools where you're not required to do much, but a teacher with pride will want to do more.
No, definitely. A lot of teachers will do things because, the people I would normally work with are people who are doing things outside of their job anyway. But, I definitely know, like, say, tech directors, like someone in John's position. I know some tech directors at schools who have a pretty easy life, quite honestly, because they're honest with me because I'm not their boss and I'm just a friend, and like, and they really do.
So, John, what do you think about that?
No, John's not one of them. John never has an easy life.
I know. I'm not going to comment on that, but I would say the colleagues in my network, everybody's working too hard and does a great job.
Yeah.
One thing that, Pete, we're going to need, I think is really important to talk to about. Through COVID, there was this whole DEIJ movement that became very prominent and really important. There were some excellent articles that surfaced, and it was very apparent there was a disconnect in the way a lot of schools were looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I know that we're all aware of it. Awareness is very different from being able to action something. And that's something that, I think is everybody's hope. And a lot of people are doing a lot out there in the space. There are organizations, there are individuals that are really amplifying the importance of us coming to terms with that and really doing some introspection and really looking at the systems and not just the people, but what are we doing systematically not to have a far more open, diverse type of recruitment and pool of teachers and diversity in our staffs. Talk to us a bit about that as a recruitment agency. And I know I'm not asking you to talk about it as a representative of all recruitment agencies, but I know that different agencies, and like yours, have really taken this on board. Talk a bit about that journey. How did that come about? And what are some concrete things? And I know everybody wants it to happen very fast, and organizations are much more complex, and change sometimes can be much more, it's slower and maybe not as clear or maybe more fragmented. But I would like to hear your personal opinion on this and how important that's become.
Yeah, and it's a big topic, John, and I think we're not going to be able to get into all of it now. But I'm really happy with Search Associates and our CEO Jessica Magana. Jessica's father, John Magana, started Search Associates, so it's in her DNA. Search Associates. This is probably her major focal point. Of course, the company and placing candidates and school leaders and work, that's all important too. But this is the thing that she's taken to heart. So we as a company have gone through trainings. We have consultants working with us. How do we make our application process more open and inclusive? What do we do? How do we contact schools? For example, if a school signs up to be a Search Associates member, their application or their data page has pointed questions. Do you have DEI policies? Are you doing DEI training at your school? Yes, no. If so, yes. What? Does your government have any laws against inclusion in terms of orientations and race, religion, anything like that? Those are questions that are right on the school's data page that candidates can see. We no longer have photos, for example, on the applications. We keep things very open and inclusive. The problem is it's a slow haul with some international schools. There are many that are just leading the way. We get emails from schools saying, we want to diversify our teaching body. Do you know of any diverse candidates that we can interview? So there are schools who are actively and proactively seeking to diversify their teaching body. However, there are certain schools who are not, driven sometimes by parents. I know that, for example, in Vietnam, I spoke to a few school leaders who would like to diversify their student body, but the parents didn't want a certain type of teacher. And this is for-profit school in a situation where the parents were mainly host national, but they wanted that British kind of teacher in front of the room teaching. And that's what the parents were expecting from an international school. Some countries have laws that prevent the school from being more progressive. I know of many school heads that are frustrated and quite embarrassed that they can't hire a more diverse faculty because the laws of that country will not permit them to do so. I spoke to a candidate yesterday who got offered a fantastic job in a country in the Middle East, is very worried to accept because of his orientation. And what a shame. I'm speaking to this is 2022, and I'm speaking to an adult professional educator who can't go to a certain country and teach kids and do what he does best because of who he chooses to love. It's none of anyone's business. So we were heartbroken talking about this. So on some levels, a lot of movement has happened, and the bar has moved way forward, but there's much more to happen. I don't know if I've answered the question. I've kind of
absolutely no.
but it's such a labyrinth right now.
It is a labyrinth, and this is so important. But I think also it's so complex because you're dealing, and thank you for bringing that up. We're dealing with a very different cultures around the world that have different perspectives on LGBT plus, and I think one has to be at least candid and aware that those are challenges, and that is very difficult, and those are some of the huge mountains that we have to climb as a community of educators.
And chipping in there, John, I think this is where I think organizations that have agencies that have associates connected to candidates. I'm working with 2 candidates right now who have job offers. They do not want to broach this with the school, their orientation, because they don't want to out themselves. It's none of anyone's business. So what I'm doing is I'm contacting that head of school directly for them, saying, I have a candidate who's really interested in your school. Will your school be welcoming to LGBTQ plus candidates, and or the country be welcoming? Can you give me quick thoughts? So I can find information out for those candidates and provide them with some basis of knowledge. What I can see happening in the future is we'll probably have networks where teachers can talk openly about these. Rather than having an ISR about complaining, we could have a chat group. So there are some informal ones out there, but I'd like to make it more formal where people can actually talk to other teachers about their experiences in different countries so they can get it from people who have been on the ground. I think that's really important. Like even when we say teachers should talk to teachers before they go, because then you're hearing it from people who are on the ground working in that situation. So I think if there's somehow we can get teachers more information, then we can go from there. What I also tell candidates is if you're looking at a job in a country, say that women's rights are not as strong as they should be in that country, and you are a teacher and you choose to go to that country, if you can live with that, if you can say, okay, this is the law of this country where maybe I'm not allowed to drive a car, for example. If you can live with that without having it burn a hole in your heart, then maybe you can go to that. But if that's going to bother you to your soul, you should really think about that, because you as an expatriate teacher are not going to be in the position to change that government's point of view. And if you choose to be out there doing that, then you run the risk of this could be challenging for you in terms of repercussions. So people have to think long and hard about where they choose to go and how they feel about that. Like, of course, I think that it's wrong to women's rights everything should be equal. There's no problem with that. But if I'm going to go to a country that overtly states that it's not, I have to be really careful about that, because if I can live with that, fine. And I do talk to teachers who ask questions about going to countries that are predominantly one religion. And I say, well, for example, I've lived in Islamic countries, and the hospitality and the kindness is just overwhelmingly cool. So you can't go what's in the media. You have to really find out what's happening on the ground in those situations, in those countries.
Thank you, Pete. No, I really appreciate that. And I think, there are a lot of organizations and individuals that are doing DEIJ training in schools. And I know
Mhm.
CIS, ECIS, ERCOS,
Yep.
a lot of
Yep.
organizations have gone full on and really made an effort.
Mhm.
There's ALOC. There are a lot of other organizations supporting, different leaders from diverse communities. And
Well,
I think
I look at it this
that's
way.
really important.
John, one of the nice things about this, one of the few nice things about being old is you have perspective, right? So I remember back in a few decades ago, some students asked me in a school we were both teaching at. They asked me can I help them start a GSA? And that caused a lot of hullabaloo at the school. I remember doing a faculty meeting about it and getting a lot of pushback.
Can you give us
and
the
that's so.
acronym of GSA, Pete, just for people that might not be familiar?
A gay straight alliance, sometimes called GSSA. So it's a gay straight student alliance. So it's an all alliance where students come together to support each other, no matter the orientation. So where they were starting in the 90s, there was a lot of pushback, and now that is so common. You'll see rainbow flags in schools. You'll see, everyone's value, love is not gender based. You see all these great things happening in schools from the students. A lot of the students are driving this change, and then the adults are saying, "Yeah, I got to gear up here. If I'm not there, I got to get on the board with this." So I do remember that if we're going from that level to what's happening now, I think a lot of strides have happened.
I agree with
good
you.
movement has happened, but
Yeah.
if you take it now and we see what should be, I think sometimes you don't look back and say, what was it like? And what is it like now? What it's like now is not good. I agree. I don't like where we are now. We need to do more. But where it was a while ago was archaic. If you really think about it. And you say, how could that have been? Why would someone push back on a GSSA group that kids just wanted to support each other? And now those are so commonplace in schools. I think most schools probably don't even need them because it's just embedded now in the school. But what's the?
And I think
love is love, right? There you go.
Yeah.
And I'm not being
Your
political.
point's an important. Yeah, an important point you brought up is there's a lot of student activism and awareness, and students saying we want this and reaching out to faculty and getting faculty support. And I've experienced that in different school settings, and I think that's really refreshing. And then at the same time,
and John, I think there's a point. I think we're focusing on orientation a little bit and gender, but I do think racial equity is happening as well. Where we like Search Associates goes to the People of Color Conference in San Antonio. I was there last week. We're reaching out to groups and trying to say, are you aware these opportunities are out there? Because I think certain groups don't even know that these opportunities exist, or they haven't explored them because they feel the opportunity will not be there for them. So I talked to, I don't know how many, I'm a chatter, John, I'm a chatter. So I'm chatting to everyone at this conference. And people are like, really? You can go overseas and teach like that? I said, you bet. I don't know why more Americans don't want to do this. There's no violence, there's no lockdown, there's no guns in Vietnam that you have to be scared of. So you can go teach and have this great life and save a bit of money and explore the world. Why aren't more people doing this? So I think, for example, at the People of Color Conference, I think what I got from that was the majority of the folks at that conference, the teachers at that conference, didn't even really know that this existed for them. They knew it existed, but I don't think they realized that this is accessible for anybody. I hope I worded that right.
Absolutely.
I think I was going to say, I think when it comes to the racial discrimination, I'll push back a little bit. I think it's maybe even worse than maybe you guys are putting it out to be. I'll give you an example. I was at the ERCOS conference recently in Asia. ERCOS leadership. I don't know how many people there were. Maybe 900 people. I'm guessing, people of Black, African origin, maybe 2-3 people there. A very small percentage of Asian people. We were in Asia, there wasn't even that many Asian people there. It was all people who looked like the three of us, basically. So, and you think that's, I think if you took another industry, I bet you'd have better representation than schools. I mean, I think schools have a lot to do, I think, really.
Yeah, and that's what we're saying. Like
Yeah.
it was the bastion of it's. If you look at heads of schools, that cadre of schools, there's a euphemism that used to be the great white fathers that would
Yes.
run these schools, right? And then they're all, I think, great people, like really educationalists. But that face of the world is changing. There
Yeah.
are many more females of color, different ethnicities, races, different orientations as heads of schools. So you can see that happening. You can see the change. So
Yeah.
schools are recognizing that they have not done a good job of this.
Yeah.
So, like in the United States, it's by law. Like, it's a law about discrimination. International teaching, we're pushing a movement for this to happen. So I agree.
Yeah.
If you go to the typical conference, you will see a great deal of white teachers, put it that way,
Yeah.
Caucasians.
Definitely.
But I think that's changing. And I think that's changing rather quickly, actually.
I think Dan's point's an important one. I think we still have a long way to go.
bet.
And I think,
Yeah.
in industry, and Dan, your point's an interesting one, because if you look at the tech world or a lot of other industries, it tends to be far more diverse. I think the other group is also women in leadership. That's another thing where that still is an area where we really have to amplify the role of women and empower them to be in those leadership roles. I think this issue, and we've been talking a lot, it's really important. I think it's very complex. It's very nuanced. I think however different people look at it through different lenses, there is movement. There are people understanding this has to change. It's changing, maybe not at the rate or at the pace for some, but I feel that there's a collective awareness that we have to, and sometimes you have to start with a collective awareness and internalize that before you can start actioning and changing structurally systems. But I think we maybe even are at the stage where systems and structures are starting to change. So thanks for that.
Well put, John. Well put.
Yeah. So I think one thing and thank you, Pete, this has just been great to hear all these ideas and strategies. Where do you see recruiting going here? Okay, so we have chatbots. We could actually have a chatbot do the first interview with me, maybe as a candidate. I'm just wondering, where are you seeing recruiting? How are you strategically as an organization? You gave the anecdote of you go in a city, you're X amount of schools, and you're noticing a lot of candidates are saying, no, I'm not physically moving, but I can be on Zoom. What are you guys, or you as a recruiter, and your thinking and your vision of what's next? What are some things you'd like to share, just highlight before we wrap up?
I don't know. Is that a good answer, John?
I think
there's so much going on that, and I'm looking at it where, how do we keep the humanistic approach to this? How do we keep? Maybe I'm old school. I think that teaching is about people and relationships. So, even on resumes, let's segue to cover some things that we haven't covered for a teacher who's looking to recruit. The resume really shouldn't be a black and white list of duties. I did lesson plans. I think your resume now could express who you are as an educator, philosophically and pedagogically. So, rather than writing, I created lesson plans. Okay, isn't that a basic expectation for all teachers? Shouldn't you expand upon that and say, I created inquiry-based learning experiences, differentiated to accommodate all learning styles? Then you're telling a school that you are aware of inquiry, differentiation, inclusion, learning styles in one statement, rather than saying this. So I created a classroom atmosphere that enabled students to feel comfortable taking academic risk. If you're an art teacher, do you want to make sure that kids feel comfortable, like taking an artistic risk, but being vulnerable? If you're a counselor, so why shouldn't you not mention, if you're a teacher on your resume, shouldn't you have something about students and learning on your resume rather than wrote lesson plans? Like if I'm a banker, I'm sure you wrote about money on your resume. How do you handle finances, right? So as a teacher, shouldn't you do the same thing? So I guess what I'm getting around to is the importance of the relationship and the communication skills that a teacher should possess. So how do we keep that in the recruitment process? Where for a relationships-based game, put it that way, a relationship-based industry, then how do we keep that in the world of technology? Where Zoom is good, but it's not as good as me being there with you. So how do we do both of those? I think that's my big macro conflict. Like we can say we can have AI do all these things, but then is AI can have built-in bias, whoever creates the AI when they're screening candidates? What is the bias from AI? How do we assist schools in now they're being bombarded by hundreds of emails every day for applications to jobs? How do we have schools manage that in a humanistic way? Because the before times, you had to apply at a job fair. There was no way to contact a school. So how do we leverage technology and still keep the humanistic side to this? I'm not answering your question, but
no,
that's where I'm at.
Yeah,
that's where I'm at. I'm like,
I think it's a good place to finish, definitely. It was
yeah,
great.
I think that, right?
Pete, that's a great place for us to wrap up, because I think at the end of the day, as you said, and I think Dan and I in conferences, and one thing that we like is those relationships we build. And Dan just spent 3 months in Asia, and I know most of his days were connecting with other people, having conversations, spending time with them, maybe having a golf game or whatever it might be, but developing those relationships. And we are in an industry where having strong, purposeful, authentic, caring relationships is so important. And we want to model that idea of equity and understanding and differentiation. We want kids to see that, and that's the world we want to really impact. So on
John,
that note, Pete, go ahead.
If you were to think about it, for me, when I was hiring to staff a school, I wanted the world in front of the kids. So I was purposely and intentionally hiring singles, married, same-sex couples, different races, different, anything I could get there. I wanted the students to experience, hey, my teacher's from Kenya, and he's really good. Or my teacher, Miss Jane, is married to Miss Alice, and they're really good. I love her. She's great. So I want those people to be in front of kids, because then that changes how people view others. Once you meet them, and then once the parents meet those teachers and realize these are great educators, then views change. It's like when you meet these people, not these people, when you meet people face to face and realize this is a good person, this is a high quality teacher, it all changes. But if you're just left in this remote digital world, you're not interacting in the same way. I mean, it's good enough. Like I'm Zooming with candidates today. We have a bond after we Zoom that's much better and deeper than when I just email back and forth. So Zoom gets you kind of there, but how can we enhance that? That's what that's where I'm going. That makes sense.
Absolutely. No, it makes absolute sense. Well, Pete, thank you so much. This has been really a wonderful journey, and to hear and get your guidance and share your opinions. And also, I think what's been really helpful for Dan and I is just understanding the complexity and the nuances of this industry of recruiting international educators around the world.
And I thank you guys for giving me the opportunity. It's fun to see you again, John, and meet you, Dan. But I mean, if you ever want to do one on just recruiting and how we can help teachers do it, we segued way out of the way for that. But that's what we normally do, John, I guess, when we talk, right?
Definitely. Let's do another one. Sure.
Yeah. But we could
face thank you very much.
If you're a teacher, what do you do, right? There's what we can do, right?
Pete, thank you very much. International Schools Podcast. Don't forget the show notes. Pete was very kind to put some information on there and his bio, and I'm sure you can get in touch with him too if you have further questions. Dan, any parting thoughts?
No, great chat. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Cheers, guys. Take care now. See you, John.